Lead poisoning has been a specialty of mine in addition to fires and other things for a very long time. Probably I'm one of the first lawyers in the city of New York that started bringing actions for children who have been poisoned by lead. You have to understand a little bit of the history of lead poisoning and understand why cases are brought and how cases come about. So before 1960 or so, lead was a significant component of paint. And when I say paint, I mean actually paint that you paint in walls, houses, apartment buildings. And the reason why lead was such a good component of paint is because it's heavy and it dries fast. So they would put it on the wall. It would dry fast. It's heavy. It's bulky in a liquid form. And so it would last a long time because of its quality and because of the basically what makes lead lead. The consistency of it, the composition of it makes lead an excellent quality for paint. So painters would use it because it would help them. Landlords would use it because it lasted a long time and it was a win-win. Except that what would happen many, many times, and you got to remember, the city of New York, like a lot of cities, is old. It's not like cities in Florida, which have, come about in the last 20 years. Apartments a year, the city of New York is how old? Over 100 and something years old. And we have all these apartment buildings that go back to 1900, 1906. And those apartments were all painted with lead. In or around 1950s or so, it was determined that lead is toxic to the human body. So you have this dichotomy of lead being toxic to the human body and yet being a great substance to be used on the wall. So how do we get to lead poison? As apartments became older and pipes became older and brick became older and more porous, there were water leaks. Water leaks from apartments, from a break in the pipe. Water leaks from because the pointing system on the outside of buildings started to crumble. And so what happens is that the water gets into the wall behind the paint and causes peeling. I'm sure we've all been in buildings. You've been in a building where you see a crack in the wall. So little children have a tendency. That tendency is to pick at things. I mean, what child do you see that doesn't pick at something? So they would pick at whatever the chip is on the wall, the crack on the wall. And as kids do, I mean, we all know little kids, what do they do when they get something in their hands? They put it in their mouth. You've got to remember, a little kid who's walking around, maybe a year of age, a little older than that maybe, they're walking around, they see a chip, they see something on the wall, they pick at it, and they put it in their mouth. So if you do that enough, that lead gets into your bloodstream. And from being in your bloodstream, it can travel to the brain. And once it travels to the brain, it inhibits blood flow and brain function. So what happened over time is that these various kids were coming in with issues, and eventually they determined that one of the reasons that these children were having issues learning is because they all had homes where when the nurses and the doctors questioned the parents, like, what's going on in your house? We're trying to figure out a cause for your child's problem. They would talk about the environment in which the child was being raised, the environment in which the child was living in. And eventually there were all these studies done that determined that lead was causing the problem. So in 1960, lead became banned to be utilized in paint. So you say 1960. 1960 is 64 years ago. So why are we still having issues with lead paint? Well, here's the answer. The answer is because landlords, when they paint the apartment, they don't remove the prior layers. I mean, when you paint your house, when you paint your own apartment, you don't go and you scrape off all the layers. You just paint over the old ones. You take some, spackle if there's a crack or something, and you spackle over it, and then you paint over the spackle. So what happens still is if there is a water leak or damage of some kind to the apartment, once you start picking at the layers, you're just picking off what old layers of lead paint. So there are all these apartments. There's apartment stock in the city of New York. I mean, how many apartments do we have in the city of New York? Millions. That have lead paint in them, with children that are running around putting things in their mouth. And what happens is a parent, a tenant, will complain to a landlord that there's water damage in the apartment. And the landlord says, I'll get to it when I get to it. And you have a little kid who's picking at the wall, and eventually it gets determined that they're having issues, and they go for what we call a blood lead test, which is under the initials PB, that's the lead. And doctors now test routinely for lead in the system. And it's been determined, I mean, if you go back to, I'm going to say the 70s and the 80s, initially we didn't think there were any problems with causing injury and issues to children unless the lead level in the child's bloodstream was above 25 or 30. We have determined over the years that lead can cause a significant problem even at levels as low as 5 or 7 or 10. And so, that's come about as a result of all the studies that were done regarding lead. And there's hundreds and hundreds of articles involving lead and the effect upon children. And I will say that at least with regard to the city of New York and the housing authority and other city agencies, they have done a pretty decent job of trying to eradicate lead. But what happens is a child will go to a doctor. The doctor will do the test. The test will determine that the child has a lead level. Let's say I'm going to use the level of 10. I'm going to say the level's 12. Once that occurs, the doctor is obligated under the law these days, and has been for a good 15, 20 years, to notify the health department. And once the health department gets notified, they actually make a trip to the apartment where the child resides, and they take a special machine and they put the machine against the wall, and that machine will go beyond the first layer of the paint and determine how much lead there is, believe it or not, they can determine this, in each chip of paint that's on the wall. And if it's determined that it's beyond the certain number that you're allowed, that there's a violation under the law. The New York City Department of Health will actually take a red stamp. It's actually got the words lead on it, and stamp the wall where there's a violation. And they go from room to room within the apartment, testing different sections of the walls and the doors and the frames of the windows to determine where lead is. They then issue a violation to the landlord, and the landlord is obligated these days to eradicate the lead within the apartment. And that means what they haven't done since the building was built means they have to actually strip the entire wall, get all the levels of the lead paint that was there before. They actually have to strip it down, get down to the sheetrock, put up new sheetrock, and put on and apply new layers of paint. So that little kids who now, if there's water damage and they pick at the level at the paint chips, will not be lead poisoned. I mean, we've represented over the years, I've probably represented 200 to 300 children who have been significantly injured because they basically will eat lead from the wall because they put it in their mouth. I've actually tasted lead paint chips myself, and believe it or not, it's actually sweet. It actually tastes like candy. And so you give a little kid candy, and what are they going to do? They go back because that's something sweet, and it's delicious to them. And so as much as a mother or a parent can tell their children not to go to the wall and to, strike their hand when they start picking, which is a lot of what parents do, children will inevitably go back. And so, our job as lawyers is to represent the people. And if there's a building that's before 1960 and there's peeling paint on the wall, it's the obligation of the landlord to go and investigate. Let me repeat that. If there's a building built before 1960 and the tenant complains of peeling paint on the wall, the landlord has an obligation under the law to go and investigate to see if lead is present in the levels that are a violation behind the first level, behind the first layer. And if there is, then the landlord's obligated under law to eradicate that condition because of the devastating effect that lead can have on little children. So, we represented, as I've said, probably 200 to 300 of these infants, these children. And generally speaking, when these children are young and they don't understand and they're eating lead paint is also at the times that their brains are being more formulated. I mean, when you think about it, we're born into this world, and yet we're really not ready for this world when you think about it. I mean, we come out, we can't walk, we can't talk, we can't feed ourselves, right? So we develop over time. And so when these children are eating these lead paint chips, their brains and their bodies are still developing, and lead will impede significantly that development. It will cause brain damage. It can cause motor function difficulty. And one of the main things it causes is a hyperactivity. The lead in the bloodstream makes you jumpy. Think about having so much sugar in your system, right? If you eat too much sugar, you become jumpy, or think you have that much caffeine. So when these children get into school, they can't sit still. They're very what we call hyperactive. Hyperactivity is a major side effect of a lead-poisoned child. And so they don't learn. They can't sit to learn. My parents tell me all the time that they don't listen. The children don't listen. They don't listen because they can't comprehend them because they don't sit long enough. If you look at report cards of children who have lead poisoning and have been lead poisoned, the teachers always talk about a lack of concentration and a fidgetiness. They just can't sit still. What we do is we represent these people in actions against the landlord who have the obligation to eradicate the lead from the building. And that's their job. When they buy these buildings, they know that. They all know the regulations. And their failure to do so causes significant injury to these children. So, that's a little history about lead poisoning and what it does and what we do. And we've recovered significant amounts of money for people whose children have become lead poisoned. Generally speaking, it's not adults because adults are usually smart enough not to be eating lead off the wall. The other way that children become lead poisoned is from what we call lead dust. So even let's say a child who's 4 or 5 is generally smart enough to know that they shouldn't be eating paint chips on the wall, right? But if there's so many paint chips that the particles invade the apartment and the apartment becomes, I don't want to use the word filmy, but sort of dusty because, think about, the sheetrock and think about paint chips and how small they are. They will be inhaling it. An inhalation of paint dust is just as devastating as eating it because you are sucking it in all the time as opposed to eating the paint chip. So that's another way that older children who are in an apartment that may have lead on the wall and may have paint chips or cracks from water damage or from pointing outside become lead poisoned. And the last way, which I'm sure that many of us remember, the water in Flint, Michigan, where the water system was infiltrated by lead significantly, that these children are bathing in it, drinking it, their parents are cooking in it. And again, there was lead in pipes and coating of pipes. And so even in the city of New York, while it's not as prevalent in terms of water, there are buildings which have become toxic from the lead in the water. And these are the ways that they become lead poisoned. The other kind of case that we've had besides against the landlord in their own apartment is, listen, what two sets of parents don't work these days? So what do? They bring their children to daycare. So they bring it to a daycare center. Those daycare centers are just experiencing the same type of problems with lead over the years as does an apartment. So we've had cases involving entities that we've sued because at a child care facility, at a babysitting facility, under the same conditions. So that's a little history about lead poisoning and how we get involved in cases.